Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. We will be sharing our perspectives and your own. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day for men, for women, and especially for children.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships, but for many years, men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live in the knowledge that they are dispensable and shamed. There is an enormous job ahead of us, but my hope is that the 21st century will see men and women standing shoulder to shoulder and working together to actively take on the feminists and to show everyone that domestic violence is not and never has been a gender issue.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. We will be inviting you to call in and discuss your views and your experiences. Anyone of any age, sex, sexual orientation or religious background is invited to call in and talk. We may not get to everyone, but we will do our best within the show's allotted time. If you do wish to call in to share your own experiences, you will probably want to keep things on a first-name basis. You may wish to use a pseudonym for yourself or family members so that there's no concern about privacy. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. The truth is often painful to hear, but in truth there is hope, and we hope you will stick around to hear it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I'm your co-host, Dean Esme. A few short announcements before we begin. This week we have shortened the name from Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey to simply Revelations with Erin Pizzey, because we want to be able to expand to talk about more than just domestic violence, although that's not a passion we'll ever let go of. I also wanted to make a special note. We would like to dedicate this episode to our friend Andy Thomas of A Voice for Men UK. Andy Thomas, whose voice you just heard on our new intro, by the way, could not be with us this week because tragically and very unexpectedly, his father passed from a heart attack just a few days ago. And Andy, we want you to know that our thoughts and our prayers are with you. And your father, Ray, had a lot to be proud of in his son, Andy, and we're proud to know you. So, with that said, we'll go on with our show. Today I'm excited to say that we have two guests on our show. Lyndon, famous author of No More Sex War. Say hello to the people if you would, Neil.
Hi Dean. Hello people. Hello Erin and Glen.
And also we have Glen Poole, who is currently heading up the third National Conference for Men and Boys. Glen, would you like to say hi?
Hi everyone.
And Erin, say hi to the lovely people.
Hello, everyone.
All right. Today's show is going to be a little bit different because we're just going to mostly be doing a round table discussion. I'm going to start off with Neil, especially because Neil probably can't stay for the whole duration of the show. Now, Neil has a long career as a journalist going back many decades, and I think the book that he wrote that got him in the most trouble was No More Sex War. Does that sound about right, Neil?
That was the only book that got me into trouble. The rest of my career has been utterly blameless.
Well, there you go. And what got you in so much trouble? You appear to have identified misandry as a real thing. Do you think that's the root of it?
Well, let me just introduce the background to the book and to my thoughts. And if you'll let me do that, it'll take me a few minutes just to talk continuously, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Thank you. Essentially, the genesis of my thoughts about feminism goes back to a teenage conversion, a political conversion in the 60s to leftist attitudes. And I was drawn to the left in the early 60s, 61, when I was 15, through the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And I became quite quickly an officer of the campaign for nuclear disarmament. I was secretary of the branch in my area. I was regional secretary of youth CND in the Southwest. And through CND, I met members of the Communist Party who introduced me to the thinking of the Communist Party and to the harder left generally, which influenced my thinking for the next 10 years. And in some ways, the whole story of my political life since then, and I'm now in my late 60s, so it's 50 years, has been the story of an odyssey away from those commitments, those perceptions, those revelations, those attitudes of adolescence in the 60s. So that, for instance, and this is a key point, I was committed to the radical student left of the late 60s, and I very well remember the moment in May 1968 when news of the new modern feminist movement in America arrived in Cambridge, which is where I was. And I remember feeling at the time, this is profoundly questionable, because of the idea that it was advancing at the time, that women were in some kind of comparable position to the position of blacks in America, that the same kind of class ideology and description could be applied to women. And I questioned that at the time, and more in the 70s, so that actually one of the first things I published that was skeptical of modern feminism was to do with Erin and her Civic Women's Refuge. There was a film about her in 1973 when I was television critic of The Listener, which irked me greatly about the attitudes that it took to men and women and to domestic violence. And I wrote that Erin herself had recited some lines of radical pap about men and women. And you would be interested to know, Erin, that those words themselves were deleted from the text. They were censored from the text in 1973. I wasn't allowed to say something so disrespectful about men and women. So in the 70s and 80s, my attitudes and skepticisms about feminism progressively deepened, not least because the ways in which men were being treated by society, especially in divorce as fathers, were so spectacularly ignored or disregarded or even or even treated with contempt. That the idea that this was a movement that drove towards sexual equality became less and less tenable. And in the late 80s, I began to write in The Independent and in the Times, The Independent on Sunday and the Sunday Times, questioning elements of the feminist orthodoxy. Like, for instance, I think I was the first to raise questions about the numbers of young men committing suicide. I was one of the first to raise questions about the absence of all rights for unmarried fathers. And in 1991, I wrote a big article in the Sunday Times, which caused an enormous hoo-ha, in which I questioned really the ideology of feminism as a whole, and that was followed by the book in 1992, which I think, I would claim represented a forensic dissection of the ideology of modern feminism. And I don't actually believe that there's been anything more radical than that book in 1992. And that completely wiped out my career as a conventional journalist, and caused a great deal of other trouble too, not least the abduction of my son and my having to fight for years in the courts of Scotland over custody and access, and I was bankrupted and I was ostracized, and all the things that happened to Erin happened to me. So that in brief, and thank you for giving me so much time to explain that. That's the story.
All right, that's very interesting. I'm amused to hear that you savaged Erin, and I mentioned it to her, and she chuckled a bit. What were you going after Erin about exactly?
Well, Erin was then, I don't know what the name of your title was, Erin, to Civic Women's Refuge, but
I didn't have one.
Founder, weren't you?
Yeah.
And I think it was Jack, your then husband, who made a film about you for BBC Two.
No, it wasn't my husband. It was Michael White. Michael White, who was a filmmaker. He'd just come out of film school, and the mothers particularly chose him because they didn't want to politicize, because at that point, everything, as you said, was massively left-wing and the beginning of the feminist movement, and we knew that they would try and hijack it, and Mike, at that point, had no political allegiances, so he made the film. And And the most important part for me was by then, men were working with us from the very beginning, because I certainly was a feminist for about 5 minutes till I listened to what they were saying about destruction of the family and disinheriting men from the family. This was in the big early collectives, which you wouldn't have been able to attend because no men were allowed to be there.
You know, I did go to the history workshop at Ruskin in 1970. One of the very few men who did.
Well, at the end of the day, though, I think it's been a huge tragedy. What happened to me, and of course, my trouble, and it's the trouble now, no man, when he employs a woman solicitor, will know that whether she's a feminist or not. And if she's a radical feminist, she'll do her best to destroy him. And the same is true of many, actually, male lawyers, because we don't know how many of them support feminist ideology. And it's a very frightening and right way through to publishing, trying to write novels with radical feminists as your editors, because you don't know till you get them. And eventually, I've lost 2 houses in my life because they decided to tear my contracts up. And
yeah, well, I think, you now have to presume that everybody in the media political establishment is
and the judiciary.
And just as an example, every single reviewer who was commissioned to review my book was a feminist, which I described as being like giving a book that was critical of the papacy solely to cardinals to review.
I think that's still true, actually, because I wrote last year, This Way to the Revolution, and my publisher, Peter Owen, wouldn't believe that they wouldn't get one single review, because that's how they deal with me. They ignore me. I didn't get a single review. Yeah. Well,
all the reviews that were written of my book were written by feminists from a feminist point of view, and nearly all of them were ad hominem attacks on me, not a discussion of the arguments that I had brought forward. and they were all commissioned by a feminist establishment in the media, which I'm sure we're going to come on to this later, Dean, but one of the reasons that I am profoundly pessimistic about change in Western culture is because of the scale of the penetration of the Western political media establishment of these orthodoxies. So that, in fact, pretty much everybody who is a member of that establishment is signed up to the orthodoxies of the feminist faith.
Well, I think it's confusing to people listening who aren't, in a way, embroiled in the history of this movement. But it's easier to actually get people to understand. Now, in England, they're talking about getting rid of the word husband. It is that ingrained. I think it's important, though, to say, I don't feel concerned anymore because there's a split coming between those people who are working at the coalface and the advocates. The feminists actually it's nothing to do with domestic violence. It's nothing to do with men. It's always been to do with money. Do you remember what they did is to remove the goalpost? It wasn't capitalism anymore in the late 60s. It wasn't capitalism. It was patriarchy. Patriarchy is all men. So they've managed to build themselves a huge empire. It's $1 billion empire, which can still cut men out completely. And that's their power base, and they're not going to give it up.
Let me interrupt the two of you for a moment and ask a question. All right, you talked about how, Neil, you came out of the political left. Erin, you were more or less apolitical, although I've noticed on your Facebook page you describe yourself as liberal.
I'm a lover of God in all his aspects.
Well, there you are. So, would you say, Neil, I think I already know the answer, but would you say, Neil, that this means you've turned more conservative or even Tory-minded generally?
No, I regard myself as really having no political affiliation now, of left or right. I'm very much interested in progress and change, and many of the views that I adopted in my early political life have stayed with me. I remain a Republican, for instance.
Just to interrupt you, for our American listeners, by Republican, he means he wants to get rid of the monarchy in the United Kingdom. He doesn't mean that he's a U.S. Republican.
Thanks very much. Yes, that is absolutely true, yes. And many of my beliefs and desires are for progressive change, but I don't identify those beliefs and attitudes as being of the left now, because the left has, especially in the form it's taken in feminism, has displayed itself to be reactionary and against change. That was one of the early points of recognition for me in as long ago as 1970, that the propositions of feminists about men, this insistence on a patriarchal interpretation of society, was actually reactionary and actually against progress and change. They wanted to define men in terms of repression, in terms of aggression, in terms of machismo, in terms of violence, in terms of war, and so on. All of those attitudes among the young men that I had grown up with and that I was closest to, all of those were being questioned at the time by men, and still are. So feminism was actually insisting upon a view of men and masculinity, which was itself reactionary, even while it was claiming to be progressive and directed towards change. So, sorry, you asked me the question, where do I stand politically? I stand on the side of change and progress.
Fair enough. So some of our more conservative listeners will be saying, oh, he's just another progressive, doesn't understand how the left messed everything up. But that's all right. We're going to not go into that sort of argument. Just wanted to kind of poke you on that because I think most of the issues we're talking about should not be viewed on a left-right spectrum. I think a left-right spectrum is a silly way to view politics. What we ought to be on the side of is the truth wherever we find it. Now, I'll mention Neil's book, Neil Lyndon, No More Sex War. You can find it on Amazon, only used because, of course, they hated him for it. He also had a classic article called Bad Mouthing, B-A-D, Bad Mouthing, M-O-U-T-H-I-N-G, which you can find on A Voice for Men because we reprinted it. That got him thoroughly excoriated by the political establishment at the time. Now, Neil recently gave a speech at, I'm sorry, Neil, what was it called again, the group?
It's the annual general meeting of a group called Parity in London, or in Britain, which has successfully campaigned for change on discrimination, particularly against men, but sexual discrimination generally. They've campaigned for a number of years on particular points such as the difference in pension age between men and women, and they've actually succeeded in introducing reform. So they kindly asked me to speak to their annual general meeting.
And just for anybody outside of the UK who didn't get that reference either, at least until recently, what they call pension, we call Social Security here. Women could start receiving it a good 5 years earlier than men could, even though men live shorter lives. A gap that's also growing, by the way. But so has that actually changed, or is it about to change, or what's the story? It's in the works. Well, let's hope Mr. Cameron's government actually does something on these things. From what we've seen, he's all talk and no action on a lot of stuff. I've seen Mike Buchanan from the UK party. Mike Buchanan. What's the name of this topic? Justice for Men and Boys. Yeah, I see he's there in the he's there in the chat room, and he'll be contesting a few seats and trying to give David Cameron a hard time, which I hope he's very successful with. Just to read a little. Yes, sir.
It's Glenn. Hi, Neil. Hi, Erin. Interestingly, I gave the talk at the AGM of Parity the year before, and I just want to say that they are probably the least celebrated, but one of the most successful men in equality organisations out there, and they scored millions of pounds for male pensioners in the United Kingdom. Because basically there are lots of extra benefits that go along with your pension age. So, for example, maybe getting a free bus pass or getting free dental treatment, this kind of thing, which men between 60 and 65 just couldn't get access to. And what they managed to do, fighting through the European cause, was to secure millions of pounds of support for men across the United Kingdom, very quietly and without much of a fanfare. They've done a remarkable job. So they preempted the move that is happening towards equal pension age by making sure that at least some men got some benefits that they were being denied.
And David, I think you also ought to know that David Yarwood's research, it's online, if you just type David Yarwood into Google, is the best, absolutely honest and trustworthy research figures that you can have on domestic violence.
And David Yarwood is involved with Parity?
Oh, yes, he's one of the main members. He and his wife, Anne, and they're close friends of mine. They're wonderful people. You never, ever hear about them, but they're a bedrock, and they always have been for me.
All right, well, good. I'm glad to hear this, and it's good to know. I have found in my own travels that sometimes the people making differences like this don't get mentioned enough. And that's one of the things we try to change on A Voice for Men, is to notice these things as well as make noise in general. I'm going to read a little bit from Neil's recent speech to this group, Parity. It is definitely excerpted, and you'll want to read the whole thing. It's called The Case for the Family Union, which we did put on A Voice for Men, The Case for the Family Union. I'm going to quote a little bit from, I'm going to quote at length from it, but it is going to be chopped up, so you'll want to read the whole thing. And hopefully Neil will forgive me for reading it in my brutal American accent. So chopping into it, he says, and this is me quoting Neil, "I want to begin by asking you to cast your minds back and try to think, when did you last hear or read it stated, as a matter of fact, that 1 woman in 4 suffers domestic abuse at the hands of the man she lives with? Was it this morning on Radio 4's Today program while you were eating your breakfast? Or was it in your daily newspaper yesterday? Was it on Coronation Street last Tuesday or the Archers the week before last? In my own case, this did in fact happen just the other day on the Today program when Sandra Horley, the chief executive of Refuge, I believe the organization that Erin founded.
That's right.
Was being given the freedom of the airwaves, and she came out with that figure yet again, as she has perhaps 10,000 times in the last 30 years, and was not asked, as she never has been in my hearing, where did you get this figure? What's the evidence? How do we know it's true? What about the gigantic body of reputable research which tells a completely different story? We'll come back to that sorry story in a minute, but let me take another step and ask again to try to remember when you last read, heard, or saw an item of information which stated as a matter of fact that in some way or another, women are routinely paid less than men for the same work. My own recent brush with this particular canard was last week on Twitter when my feed from the office of the most powerful man on earth told me that in the USA, women are paid 70 cents on the dollar paid to men. My reply, by the way, was to ask President Obama if this appalling, indefensible injustice applied to every woman police officer, every female member of the armed forces, every woman teacher or doctor, every female government worker whose pay comes from federal, state, or local government budgets. If so, I suggested that all these women should get themselves up a class action and sue the President of the United States from here to kingdom come. I imagine that the President hasn't had time to respond as yet. Neil?
I think he's pondering the question.
Perhaps he is. It's a very deep question. And now I'm going to jump ahead and quote a little more. Quoting from Neil, "Yet, if there is one single social group in the Western world whose members are spectacularly, undeniably in positions of disadvantage, if there is one class of people who are hopelessly and permanently crushed by inequality in education, employment opportunities, wealth, health, and prospects, it is black males of any age, but especially males between the ages of 15 and 25. It is impossible to be sentient in the modern world and not be aware of this fact. Yet not only does it never get mentioned by the most powerful and influential women in the world, I have never heard it mentioned by the most powerful man in the world, who happens to be a black man. The only times I have ever heard Barack Obama talk about men have been when he has been berating men for being feckless, negligent, or absent fathers. I imagine we can all agree that these statements are the routine stuff of our daily lives, almost as common as the weather forecast or the stock market reports. And there's a good bit more to that speech, and I do recommend reading it. But in the whole, a lot of these assertions are easily questioned, whether it's on domestic violence, whether it's on pay, whether it's on education, whether it's on health and health spending. Women are at a decided advantage in all of these things. And so what Neil said, amongst other things, is that, and I'll quote him again, "Our society can only be called a patriarchy through an act of willful denial of reality. But too many people in our time now owe their positions, their status, their income, their honors, their self-respect to the feminist orthodoxy to allow it to be demolished." And I'll stop there and commend everybody to go read the rest of the case for the family union on avoiceformen.com. Neil, you sound pretty pessimistic. You mentioned being pessimistic before.
Well, yeah, the reason that I am is because, as I said in that speech, I don't believe now that the cardinal tenets of faith of modern feminism are permeable to reason or to evidence or to argument. when I wrote my book in 1991, I genuinely did believe that it might make a difference in the sense that people would absorb the evidence, think about the arguments, and perhaps consider the question of the relations between men and women and the change that's happened to women in the last 150 years in a different light. And the fact that that didn't even begin to happen, that it was just flattened as a possibility, was symptomatic, I think, of the degree to which this establishment resists argument. Now, just on the question of domestic violence, I'd like to say that in 1996, the Sunday Times published an article by me and a statistician called Paul Ashton on the subject of domestic violence. This was at the time of the, what was the name of the famous footballer and U.S. footballer and movie star who was charged with murder?
O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, O.J. It was at the time of the O.J. trial, and Paul and I wrote a long piece in the Sunday Times, which I'm very grateful to them for having published in full, and we demolished the standard statistics on domestic violence. The piece was headlined, "Knocked for Six, the Myth of a Nation of Wife Beaters." And this article, as I say, demolished that orthodoxy, those figures. And if you read it and you took notice of the evidence, it would thereafter have been impossible to say that 1 in 4 women in our society is subjected to violence at the hands of the man she lives with. But the key point here is it made no difference whatsoever to the fact that that myth keeps being recycled constantly, daily, in all our media outlets, in all our discourse, in all our cultural discourse. And why? Because there must be something in it that we as a people, we as an age, have chosen to believe, that we want to believe. And it doesn't matter what evidence is produced to the contrary or that questions it. That's what our age has decided to believe, and it's damn well going to believe it regardless of the evidence. That's why I'm skeptical.
I think one of the major problems is that for most men, particularly men, women know darn well that they can be as violent as men, and certainly all the women I know and I mix with. But as far as men are concerned, they cannot bear the thought of an evil, dangerous, violent woman. And I found this time and time again. And that stretches right through to judges. They want women on a pedestal. They do not want women to be human like other men.
Yes, I agree with that. Do you agree with that, Glen? Is this part of your perspective?
That question to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I said a broader way. Yeah, I mean, it shows within the family cause. I mean, I often say that the way that we understand the world is through the very simple binary view that women have problems and men are the problem, and that colours absolutely every issue. Be it domestic violence, which obviously we're talking a lot about here, but also looking at stuff in the family courts or looking at the way we treat criminal justice. And a lot of what I think in reaction to that sometimes we can tend to go harshly the other way, and we have people who want to. It's interesting when we set up the first national conference for men and boys. Our idea was to get together as many different people as possible who are concerned with all the issues that you've raised in your speech there at Parity. And we had 2 sets of complainers. One was people saying, no, you've got this wrong. You're not highlighting the problems that men cause. And I'd say, well, that's not what we're about. We're about actually addressing the problems that men have. But then there'll be this other group of people who also say, but you're not focusing enough on the problems that women cause. So there's that kind of reaction against that view that men are to blame for all the world's problems, to then flip it on its head and say, well, actually, women or feminism are to blame for all the world's problems.
Sorry, Glenn.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to complete that, so what, in reality, we all know from our lives and our circles and our families that women and men both experience problems. And the world we want to live in, I think, is one where people's problems are addressed and people are held to respective of their gender, and that's where we'd like to get to. And that's incredibly difficult when the background narrative is these two tussling perspectives.
Go ahead, Erin.
I was just going to say to Glenn, if only we could actually grasp the fact that domestic violence is generational. I can trace it in my side down from my great-grandparents, grandparents, and my parents, and then the three of us, and we had to transcend our childhoods. In the refuge, 52 of the women were as violent as the men they left, and they too, eventually, most of them would accept that they needed help, let alone the fact that their partners were violent, and they were violent to their children. If we could get away from blaming everything on them and put it back to what is true, it's the effect on the child, boys and girls, in violent families who unfortunately tend to grow up to repeat the parents' pattern. That's what we should be talking about, isn't it?
You say if we can get away from this rooted attitude. But in the speech to Parity, I mentioned a clip on Israeli television with Professor Moritz Strauss of the University of New Hampshire, who was speaking about domestic violence. And he said there are now more than 230 peer-reviewed papers and research documents which show that women are as violent at home and in their relationships as men. And the interviewer said to him, so what do people say when you present them with that fact? And Maurice Strauss said, they don't believe it. They won't believe it. They won't even hear it. Now, that's been the experience, I think, of the last 40 years on this subject and the wider subject of the position of women and change for women and the role of men. And it's evident, you say, if we could get away from the way in which this subject is viewed, but we can't get away from it because it's the way in which our society has chosen to see these subjects.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say to you, Neil, I went to two inclusive conferences, one in Sacramento and one in L.A., and there, Murray was there. I've known Murray for years, and Richard Gellis, and Don Dutton from Canada. We were all there, and it was the beginning of the hope that I had, that more and more people are speaking out. I can promise you. And it's a very exciting time because the younger women who have had very feminist mothers have turned away and also recognized. And so it's coming. The change is coming.
Okay. Yes, can I just come back on that? If that is true, Erin, how do you account for the monolithic response and coverage to that recent event where Nigella Lawson and her husband were photographed in a restaurant, he with his hands around her throat? And then there was uproar in the conventional media, and the constant rehearsal of the 1 in 4 line, the constant rehearsal of the line.
Yeah, I've read it, but Neil, you said this yourself. It's a feminist.
Why were no voice?
Neil.
Question. If there is a possibility of change going on, why were no voices raised in conventional media at that time?
You know the answer. You said it yourself. These female writers are largely radical feminists.
Yes,
journalists are.
Where's the possibility of change?
What's the possibility? Those people, Nigella herself said that she was an abused child and she was a fiery nature. Those two are both. There is a consensual relationship. And all right, any chance they get, the exciting story of Nigella being abused, it's how journalists work. But at the bedrock, where it matters, actually at the moment, is the amount of research that's coming out and verifying everything that most people on the street know. Feminism is dying, actually. It's dying to death, fortunately.
That may be true. I mean, it could be like, the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but at the moment, it has an absolutely inflexible iron grip on public expression of opinion.
Well, let me go ahead and jump in here and make a couple of salient points, especially for some of our listeners. I think it is important to recognize that there are cultural things at work here, and maybe even to a certain extent biological things, because I think Erin's onto something. Men have a natural need to, instinctively, I believe, but certainly culturally, to protect women, and they just don't want to see women as bad. And I actually do suspect a lot of women privately know this and take advantage of it, to be blunt with you, especially many of the feminists, but even conservative-minded women who aren't particularly feminist. And I think that a lot of this does go back to money. That's one of the reasons why the domestic violence subject matters, because there's a lot of government money that goes into that. I find that when I talk to professionals in the domestic violence field, there's the ones who are angry, loud, and abrasive and want to talk about how all this is about men's violence towards women and children, a very misandrist view. But then I keep encountering women, it's mostly women in the field, period, but who contact me privately and say, I'm getting really tired of hearing this. And it's not that simple. I'm coming across them, which does lead me to believe that if that field can be penetrated and the young, the gray hairs start retiring and the young women and men, but it is mostly women, are far more open-minded, start taking control, then the discourse may begin changing. I'm seeing it. What we're seeing on A Voice for Men in general is that while we've had to be very abrasive and rude quite a bit of the time to get attention, people are starting to listen to what we've had to say. We just had a major uproar all across the entirety of Canada over a postering campaign on the issue of rape, which infuriated the feminist establishment there. But to our great shock, because just like domestic violence, the rape issue is supposedly entirely a matter of, I don't know what it is, 19 out of 20 women are going to be raped every 15 minutes. Is that what the stat is up to now? I don't remember, but we had a lot of men's activists putting up posters questioning a lot of that nonsense, because a lot of it is nonsense. And we found that a good bit of the media coverage was actually fairly neutral and fairly fair on the question. So I think there's reason to think this monolith may be changing, and that we may actually start moving toward the radical notion that women are human just like men are and therefore flawed just like them. But it's going to take some time. I do tend to agree it's almost like a religious faith, because just today I got into another debate with somebody who wanted me to believe once again that women are paid, I think the claim is 77 cents on the dollar now, which is ludicrous on its face because, well, for reasons that you can quote stuff from the Wall Street Journal, CBS News, numerous sources have debunked this. People don't want to believe that women aren't oppressed, but it's getting harder and harder to sustain that. And I'm pretty sure that cognitive dissonance is growing, especially in younger people. Younger people like Glen Poole, who recently gave a great speech. Actually, a year ago, he gave a great speech for TED. It was a TED event put on by the London School of Economics, I believe. Was that the case?
That's TEDx event at the London School of Economics, yeah, that's right.
And he gave this speech about a year and a half ago. I'd like to play it now because it's very good, and I want everybody to hear it if they haven't already. James, can we roll that up, please? James? Uh-oh. Well, it's a very good speech.
Glenn,
I want to talk to you about equality, and in particular I want to talk to you about gender equality. Now, men don't often talk about gender equality, and when we do, we tend to stand in one of two places. We stand either in the place of pro-feminism, or we stand in the place of anti-feminism. And I stand in neither. I stand in two places of my own. I stand in the place of optimism, and I stand in the place of activism. I'm an optimist because I genuinely believe that together we can create a world where every man and every woman and every girl and every boy can flourish and fulfill their greatest potential in a way that really works for everyone. And I'm an activist because I'm really interested in how we can utilize gender as a way and an opportunity to work with people to fulfill their potential in areas of life that are important to them. And that's why I work with men and boys. Now, when I was a boy, nothing was more important to me than beating my mates at Top Trumps. Top Trumps is a card game. It's got these different themes. It's themes like, in my day it was like dinosaurs and fast cars and footballers. I love the footballers. And you'd have these cards with footballers on, and each footballer would have a measure, like how old they were, what their height was, how many goals they'd scored, how many games they'd played. And you'd deal all the cards out, and you'd sit there with your card, wondering how you were going to beat the other players. And if it was your go, you had to pick the measure that would beat the other players. And you might have the worst card in the pack. You might have a 19-year-old who played half a game, scored no goals, right? And over here, the boy's going, I hope he picks goals because my player's got 100 goals. And over here, the girl's going, I hope he picks games because my player's played 500 games. And you go, height. And the guy over here goes, 5'7". And the girl over here goes, 5'11". And you go, 6'2", the winner. And you win all the cards. And now, the reason I mention that game is because we kind of do equalities like that. If you run a country or you run a city, what you do is you want to know how your residents are doing. And you measure them in different ways, like we measure the people on top trump cards. And you look out at the different communities in your city to find out how they're doing. And what's really great about equalities is if you find out, for example, that your black and minority ethnic community is doing worse in education, is doing worse in terms of health, is doing worse in terms of being involved in crime, is doing worse in terms of employment, you don't go, look at them, why are they doing so bad? You actually go, what is it? Look at us. What are we doing as a city that this community shows up that way? What are we, and what can we do differently? What are the barriers they face to good education? What are the barriers they face to good health? How can we change what we do to make a difference for that community? Now, in the world of gender equality, it's a bit different. Let me give you an example. We have like a global league table of gender equality created by the World Economic Forum. It's kind of like an international game of top trumps, country versus country. And there are 4 measures. And the measures are wealth and power and health and education. And as you would imagine, there's different levels of equality all over the world between different countries, right? But there's a theme. There are themes that you can see are consistent around these different countries. So in the world of when you measure wealth and when you measure power, in all of those countries, by most of those measures, men tend to come out on top. But also all over the world, when you measure health, for example, by life expectancy, you find that women tend to come on top. And increasingly, when you look at education, of these 140 countries that have been measured, there are more countries where women and girls are doing better in the world of education. There are countries where boys and men are doing better. So that's quite an interesting idea, to see that we're playing top trumps with gender equality in this way. But the way we play the game of gender equality, top trumps, has some quirks. So firstly, it's about the quantity of equality, not the quality of equality, by which I mean like a country like Lesotho in Africa, where the quality of their equality is right down here in terms of what the men and women earn and how healthy and how long they live, compared to, say, the UK. But they come in the top 10 because men and women are more level. And here in the UK, where we earn much more and we live much longer, we come about 16th or 17th because the gap between men and women is bigger. And then there's another quirk of how we measure gender equality, and this is the one I really want to share with you. And this is the one I really want to transform. It goes like this. When we look at the tables and women show up as unequal, we go, boo, let's do something about it. When we look at the tables and we see in a country men and women are equal on a measure, we go, yay, gender equality. Then we get over here, when we see a measure where men are doing worse than women, we go, yay, more equality for women. you score more points for having women do better than men. So my radical idea is this. In the world of gender equality, how about if we went like this, right? So when women aren't doing so well, we go, boo, let's see what we can do about it. When it's about equal, we go, yay, that's quite good. And when, this is the radical bit, right? Bear with me. When men aren't doing as well, we don't go, yay! We go, boo, what can we do about it? So, if we take that out into the real world, what would that look like if we actually were focused on gender equality where it wasn't like them versus us and us versus them, but it's kind of like us, all of us, men and women versus inequality? How different might that be? How different might that be if we had people measuring how men and boys were doing in our cities and then looking out into the city and rather than saying, why don't they look after their health? Why do they do so bad at school? Why are they committing so much crime? We actually said, what are we doing as a city that has men and boys show up in that way, and what can we do differently? Now, I'm not against focusing on women and equality. I think it's really important. I think there's so much more work to do, but I'm going to make the case for focusing more on men and inequality. So let me just give you some figures from the UK. So from the point when a boy is born, he's more likely to die before the age of 1. He's more likely to be rejected by or removed from his family. 25% more likely to be taken into care, 25% less likely to get out of care by being adopted. At school, he's twice as likely to have a special educational need. At school, he's twice as likely to have literacy problems. He's 4 times more likely to be excluded from school. By the time he reaches 16, he's more likely to be in youth employment. He is more likely to die, 2.5 times more likely to die by the age of 25. He's less likely to be a graduate, and if he is, guess what? 50% more likely to be unemployed when he comes out of university. Sorry guys, but that's the way it is. What else? 3 times as likely to commit suicide. Twice as likely to be the victim of violent crime. More likely to be killed by a stranger or killed by someone you know, making up 71% of murder victims. 4 times as likely to be an alcoholic, 3 times as likely to be addicted to cannabis. And worst of all for me, 95% of the prison population are men. Now that's not just male behaviour, because if it was, every single class would be in prison. If you look at the prison population today, 27% of those men were in care. 20 to 30% of those men have learning difficulties. 50% of those men are addicted. 60 to 70% of those men grew up fatherless without a male role model. 90% of young offenders were excluded from school. 90% of men in prison have some kind of mental health problem. I'll leave you with my vision, my optimism, that actually we can create a world where every man and every woman can fulfill their greatest potential and flourish. And let me give you a quick story. We had a young woman turn up to volunteer with a project I was working on with men and boys, and we couldn't quite work out what it was she wanted. We really tried to help her find a role for herself, to help her flourish and reach her full potential through volunteering. We just didn't do it. We felt like we'd failed her. And after 2 or 3 months hanging around, she just disappeared. And then she phoned me up one day, about 6 months later, and she said, I want to apologise. I want to apologise to you, because I was a bit weird when I was hanging around your project. And the thing is, 18 months ago, I was walking home through the streets of our city, and I got raped. And I saw my future was that I could be bitter towards all men from that point on. And I didn't want to be. I wanted to find out the kind of problems that men have and get over what happened to me. And through you, I saw the kind of problems and challenges that men face. And through you, I got to be around some really great men. And now I'm looking forward to a future where I can have great relationships with men. We didn't even realise it. We were helping a young woman to flourish and fulfil her greatest potential. That's what I stand for. Equality, gender equality, where together men and women are fighting for a more equal world.
We're back now. Thank you. Glenn, that was a wonderful speech. Now, I know some of our Voice for Men audience will be saying, wow, Glenn sure still seemed to be working pretty hard there to bow to gynocentric sensibilities. But honestly, I think you made the case extraordinarily well there about what the problems really look like. And it's is a very eye-opening speech that I've shown to a number of people. Now, Glen, you're heading up the 3rd national conference for men and boys there in the UK.
Yes.
For anybody who's curious, you can find out more about that at Men's Conference UK. It's all one word, mensconferenceuk.wordpress.com. And I have a question on my little cards here to bring up for discussion. And one of those questions is, who's out there really making a difference besides Glen Poole, who's obviously one of them? Is there anybody out there making a good, positive difference, guys?
Yeah, lots of people. I mean, the whole premise of the conference was to say that, look, we can't be the only people. I'm based in Brighton and Hove, which is on the south coast of England, about 50 miles from London. And the whole premise was, well, we can't be the only people who are not only concerned about these issues that we all know in health and education and fatherhood and mental health and family breakdown and all the rest of it, and also trying to make a difference. There must be other people out there, and probably other people out there are sitting around thinking, am I the only person who's doing anything? So the whole premise was to try and hunt out, try and be a magnet for individuals and organisations who were seeking on their own to tackle some of these problems, and just see what could happen if we could bring them together and start to have some conversations, see what we could learn from each other, build some networks, build some partnerships, and so on and so forth. And so the idea was, A, to put all the problems that men and boys face, the key problems that men and boys face, on the table in the same room. And the second one was to also bring some people who are actually working on delivering solutions. And I know there's been a real strong thread about domestic violence. So, for example, we've had the Mankind Initiative, who are our national helpline. I think, Erin, are you the patron of the Mankind Initiative?
I'm one of the patrons, yes.
Yeah, right. Who are doing great work, both in terms of advocacy, but also in terms of having that constant national helpline. But also an organisation in Scotland, which is doing a lot more kind of face-to-face work, called Abused Men in Scotland, AMIS, who are really, absolutely, they've really shown up in the last 2 or 3 years as being a really forward-thinking and dynamic organisation. So those are 2 really good examples, and what they're doing, they're beginning to open up a gap, which is not simply about saying, you know, the women's refuge movement and the feminist approach, that we need to attack that and break through that, opening up a space alongside that. And I think that's really important, that we, as a movement, we can tend to spend a lot of time focusing on attacking what's being done for women in quite a carte blanche kind of way, and that can make us look like we're just reactionary or anti-women, which we know we're not. We know where that kind of anger and upset comes from, but to the outside world, to the uninitiated, it can look a little crazy. And I think it's really important that we also spend some time focusing on solutions and building our muscles and our ability to actually talk about how hard it is to deliver solutions from first-hand experience. So when you get an organisation that can actually say, I was trying to help this man who was clearly a victim of domestic violence, and these are the things that got in my way, people start to listen. I'm sure there's a long, long way to go, but when you start to hear those conversations being had in a large room with lots of other people who say, hey, we had that experience in Wales, hey, we had that experience in Bristol, hey, we had that experience in Northern Ireland, then actually you start to see that change is possible, even though there's a long way to go. So, I mean, there's 2 really good examples from...
I've got a good example, Glen. There's a group called The Cafe in Canada, because I'm half Canadian, my mother was Canadian. They are actually getting together, and they're a highly motivated group of men. Steve Boulet's been talking to me about them wanting to open a place for men, and this is where they're going. And I think it's coming, and I think that there are so many projects actually beginning to work directly with men. And from the desert that it was 10 years ago when I was trying to get people to listen, now there are people everywhere that I can talk to. There's also a huge new, it's only about since May, group of leading women across America and Canada, I think. And they are actually fighting for one issue at the moment, which is shared parenting, which I passionately believe in. And they have just suddenly cropped up, and it's like wildfire.
Absolutely. Yes.
Just to interrupt real quick, because I'm always anal retentive, she said cafe. She is referring to the Canadian Association for Equality, which has been subject to a lot of rather irrational protests. I don't know if Steve Roulet, the filmmaker that Erin just mentioned, is directly associated with them, but I sense that he likes them, and he's certainly been doing some talking to their members.
Yes.
They are a group. They are not affiliated with A Voice for Men, although they have been accused of it many times because, of course, on A Voice for Men, we're rowdy and rambunctious and even rude.
And I'm a member of A Voice for Men. Andrew Thomas and I represent you in London, England.
That's right. That's right. And we don't. Not everybody has to be angry and loud, but one of the things we have found is that getting loud and obnoxious about it puts some people on the back foot and makes them listen. As Paul Elam likes to say, if people won't hear men's pain, they will hear men's anger. And frankly, if our being angry and rude makes it who are a little more mild-mannered to be heard, fine. We'll play bad cop to other people's good cop. What matters is that the message needs to be out there. I remember myself, now of course, Glen and I are younger than you and than Erin and Neil, but we're both in our 40s, and it seemed like a barren wasteland 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I remember the 90s. And even then thinking something was wrong and nobody but me realized something was wrong. And I don't even think I'd heard of your book, Neil, because of course they trashed it. You'd seen a few things, like Christina Hoff Sommers wrote Who Stole Feminism. I'm not sure anybody actually stole it. I think it may have always been problematic, but whatever. But there was almost nothing. In the last few years, I've started to see a difference, which is one of the reasons I'm in A Voice for Men. Because
I come in here?
Go ahead.
Yeah, when I was writing that book, there was a moment in October 1991, in the middle of the night, when I really did have the thought, am I the only person in the world who's thinking this? And subsequently, after the book was published, I did receive many hundreds of letters from the few countries where it was published. It wasn't even published in the United States, but from Australasia and Britain. And there were some hundreds of letters. So there were other people who were thinking the same way. But the evidence now that there are people who share the same attitudes and the same skepticism is overwhelming, and the Internet has provided it. The Internet most definitely has made an immense difference in terms of the communication of dissidence and dissent from this orthodoxy. There's no doubt about that, and it's a wonderful, wonderful change, and I'm very much welcome it. But my point of skepticism here is that I don't see a penetration of the kinds of attitudes that Glen was talking about, and there isn't any point of difference between me and him on what he was saying there. I don't see any penetration of that in my immediate personal and social life, nor in the wider political establishment. And I'd like just to give you two examples of that. I have two little girls who go to our local primary school, and our local primary school is completely a gynocracy. There's only one man in it, and he's the caretaker. And all the women who work in that school are very well-intentioned. They're all honourable people, and they all think it's their social duty to advance the cause of girls and of women because they view girls and women as being disadvantaged in the wider world. And the idea that mothers of boys at that school have a duty to the boys at that school to try to advance their equality, the equality of those boys at that school, is completely remote from their thinking, and it's as remote from their thinking as it is from the thinking of Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, who go on all the time about empowering young women and advancing the cause of young women, and never for 1 second recognize the disadvantages of boys and young men. It doesn't cross their minds. Now that, I submit, gives you an indication of the scale of the whole of this orthodoxy in our time.
Neil, let me just give you another idea. In March of this year, there was a Woman World Festival, WOW it was called, in the festival hall, and I was asked to speak. And I took Andy Thomas along with me because it's inclusive of men. It's a huge international conference of people like Alice Walker. I walked into a room and I was scared because often whenever I speak, I get heckled. This time the room was packed of women sitting against the walls. There were young, vibrant, mostly feminist women, and I talked about domestic violence and about men and women, and I ended up by saying it is so important that men and women now work together to deal with the causes and the roots of domestic violence. And only one woman disagreed. All these young women agreed that the time had come to end the gender war and men and women should work together. That's where I get my hope from.
I can tell you, too, that, again, a lot of our focus here is on domestic violence because it's something Erin and I are both passionate about, but it's something that's kind of kaleidoscopes out to all these other issues, right? You know, what I would call gynocentrism. It's all about the women all the time. I do keep getting contacted, especially by young women who actually feel bullied by their people above them into being silent about these issues. Well, the people above them, I forget which scientist said this, but I think, I can't remember the scientist's name, but he said science advances one funeral at a time, by which he meant orthodoxy and science frequently prevented dissenters from orthodox views in science. You had to wait for the old ones to die off or retire before you could advance new ideas. And
I've been feeling for a long time.
What's that?
That's very much what I've been feeling about the feminist establishment for a long time. It literally has to die out. I mean, in the way that the Politburo in the Soviet Union had to die out, you know, with the death of Gorbachev and not of Gorbachev, of Chernenko and of Brezhnev before him, and of those attitudes. And I think, to some degree, that is the case, that the old orthodoxy literally has to die out. Its proponents have to breathe their last.
And, of course, somebody who hears that, I'm already hearing it, Neil Lyndon just said we have to kill feminists. No, he did not. He said we have to wait for them to die out or retire. And you may think I'm laughing, but on A Voice for Men, we've been accused of violence, of advocating violence just for saying something like that before. It's ludicrous, of course, but it tells you just how desperate the establishment can get when you make a point that they don't like much. But in any case, it is true. I'm seeing it. There's more activity advocating against this gynocentric worldview. And even, I think, some of the old guard is starting to figure out that there's a problem. Erin just mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. We mentioned it on an earlier show. Leading Women for Shared Parenting. Leading Women for Shared Parenting, that is LW4SP.org. I don't think they could possibly have come up with an internet address that was harder to remember, but it's LW4SP, Leading Women for Shared Parenting. But what's interesting about them is, A, it's women, but B, there are feminist women, there are anti-feminist women, there are non-feminist women, women critical of feminism, women who are pro-feminism, at least in some part, all wanting to talk about why shared parenting between fathers and mothers in divorce is critically important. So this indicates even there are people calling themselves feminists who are interested somewhat in men's issues. Have you run into any people like that, Glenn?
Yeah, I think the shared parenting world is perhaps the most interesting one in that respect, because that's a focus I mean, you can understand why the domestic violence law gets so sort of tense. It reflects the kind of, the dynamic of anger and aggression between a man and woman, and it's reflected in the organisations that then set up to try and resolve that. Whereas shared parenting in its intent is about actually trying to get men and women to share and work together more effectively. And it's both before divorce and for couples who don't even end up divorcing and after divorce. And that's what makes it quite interesting, because there are different motivators and different reasons why pro-feminists, anti-feminists and non-feminists are interested in shared parenting, but in many ways they're trying to get to the same place. So what I noticed in the UK is that the fathers' rights movement, for example, is very much focused on how do we change the way the law operates when couples separate, and then the pro-feminist fathers' movement is much more focused on how do we make it more equal when the child is born. And we haven't someone said the other day, it's fantastic insight, was basically that in UK law, the only way that a father gets father's rights is by being granted it, by being granted by mum. So mum can grant father's rights in two ways. One, by marrying him, and therefore he gets father's rights for as long as they're together. And the other in the UK is by putting his name on the birth certificate. If she puts his name on the birth certificate, at that point he gets rights. He has no automatic rights in law. It's absolutely granted by mum. Now that was a pro-feminist guy who was saying that, and not a father's rights guy or an anti-feminist guy. In some ways, the pro-feminist fatherhood workers are more aware of those complexities of law. So if we could get everyone concerned about fathers' rights and shared parenting singing from a similar hymn sheet, we could see some real progress in that area. And what we saw politically as well, just quickly, around Father's Day, both the left and the right, the Centre for Social Justice on the right and David Lammy, a Labour MP on the left, were both using very different narratives, but both actually calling for similar changes. One of the changes is that all fathers are given automatic parental rights from birth. So that idea is now bubbling up on the left and the right of politics.
Yeah, I'm glad to see that. For example, apparently people are having trouble calling in. I apologize for anybody who's having technical difficulties, but I guess we've got a lively discussion going here. A lot of people, in my view, want to phrase all this in left versus right. But what I'm seeing is, for example, we have the why can I not remember it? My Q2 Cannon's Party, Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. I would have to say that they are mostly center-right, sort of Tory-minded.
Yeah.
And last I checked, that's still legal. Yet there are people on the left, what you'd call the political left, who are acknowledging many of these issues, too. So I remember Erin confessing to me probably a year ago that I remember it was a late-night conversation we had, Erin, and said, Dean, do you really think any of this can change? Do you remember that?
No.
Yeah. Well, it was late at night and you were getting tired. And I've had those same dark thoughts, too. And yet, here we are, we've got not just a voice for men, but groups all over the world coming out of the woodwork now, talking about these issues. And, well, change takes time, but I'm seeing a change in attitudes, and in what's supposedly a democratic system, changes in social attitudes, I would think, will eventually be reflected in law.
Well, can I come in here?
Only if you're not going to depress everybody.
Well, I'm sitting here quite cheerful, but even though I may be saying pessimistic things. No, I'd like to contribute some optimistic points of view. As I say, I certainly think it's absolutely for the good that internet communication now exists between people who have a different point of view. It's absolutely for the good that a voice for men exists, and that Mike Buchanan's party exists, and that Glen is doing what he's doing, and Erin's doing what she's doing. It's all to the good, because minds, individual minds do get changed. I think my greatest the focus of optimism for me actually lies with women. I think that the power for change lies with women, and if women as mothers of sons can see it as their responsibility to their sons to improve the position of boys in education and of young men in employment, and to address the position of young men in the courts and the criminal justice system. And if grandmothers can address the position of their own sons in divorce and their grandchildren in the process of divorce, then there might be change in that respect. And in fact, I did see in a car park in the northeast of England in winter 2 years ago, there was a family estate car being reversed out of a supermarket car space, and very tidy estate car driven by a very well-dressed old lady, and there was a sign in the back that said, "Justice for fathers in divorce." And I took her to be a grandmother whose own son was being badly treated in the divorce process, and possibly she was losing contact with her grandchildren, and that she was up in arms about this and wanted to do something about it. And I think that Glen and I have corresponded on this question, I think that if women can be encouraged to act on behalf of the men that they love, and if women can also see that it's in their interest that there should be change and equality in parenting and in parental leave and in family law, then I think there can be an impetus for change from that direction.
I think there can be, and it does remind me of a rather amusing incident that happened up in Toronto. We got this on camera. It's actually going to have to be. I mean, I only see one of two possibilities: either a continuing social decay and all the social sequelae that come with fatherless children, broken families, crime, suicide, drugs, and all the things that could abuse and all the things that go with it, and almost sort of social collapse, or an awakening, and people, women especially, thinking something has to change. You pointed this out, Neil, in your speech, that I'm shocked sometimes by I've actually had this experience, at least with Americans, who said black people fought for their civil rights and won them in the United States, which they did. But then I've had them look at me as if it was complete heresy when I say, yes, but that required a majority of white people to go along with it.
Yeah. And likewise, change for women by men or supported by men.
That's right. A change for, feminism has had men helping them along the whole way. Well, at some point, if women don't look and say, you know what, men matter too, this matters. Women are 55% of the electorate in countries like Canada and the United States. There's something like 51%, 52% of the population, and they're about 55% of the people who actually show up to vote. I remember one feminist, when we pointed out that makes women a majority, he screamed, it was a male feminist, he screamed, 55% is not a majority? Now, we'll cut it on tape, I'm not making it up. But now that's the kind of irrationality that you deal with. But then you get that on tape and you show it to people, and you can't help but roar with laughter. Even if you were on his side to begin with, you can't walk away from that and still take it seriously. But yeah, there does need to be a clarion call from women, I would say. You seeing a lot of women who really are trying to make a difference in this area, Glen?
Yeah, absolutely. Over the years, I mean, to echo what Neil said there, when I first really got actively involved in men's issues, working with Fathers for Justice in the UK back in 2003, so 10 years ago. And from the very outset, some of the most sort of powerful advocates were women often, usually one of two kind of women. One was the grandmother, so the paternal grandmother who had, up until the moment the mum and dad separated, been like a major force in the child's life, and then all of a sudden was removed overnight purely because she was the paternal grandmother, not the maternal grandmother. And they also bring with them a kind of the wisdom of the older generation who've seen, they've seen lots of stuff happen, and they know what goes on beyond simple sound bites about all dads being demons and all mums being Madonnas. But also second wives or second partners as well were often incredibly strong advocates, because they knew the qualities of their partner. Often that their partner would be being a fantastic stepdad to their children, but completely unable to participate in bringing up their own kids. And also just on the front line, in the charity sector and the public sector, 2/3 of workers are women. So people actually working on the front line are more likely to be women. And I like to say that we're basically two expanding and growing communities. One, we're a community of identity. Our identity is that we are men and boys. But we're also a community of interest as well, which is people are interested in making a difference to men and boys, which is where women, great women like Erin and all the women in that shared parenting organisation you mentioned, and many other women are making a big difference in frontline organisations.
On the flip side, I'm going to make a rather politically incorrect observation, which is that I think a lot of women, maybe the majority of women, actually sort of look to men for leadership on things. I don't know if somebody's going to scream in anger that I say that a lot of women look to men folk for leadership. I do think it's incredibly important that men have the courage to speak out and get past the shaming language and the efforts to shut you up, and refuse to be shut up when you see something that's wrong. I find, anecdotally, in my personal experience, that when I refuse to back down with somebody who's giving me gynocentric rubbish about the supposed, superiority of men, superior status, of men, and the endless, complete victimization of women, I refuse to back down, and I refuse to respond to the name-calling. There's men, but there's also women who immediately respond to that, and they see, oh, he's not backing down. He won't back down. Maybe I need to listen to what he's saying, because he's not just full of it, and he won't be silenced just by me saying, well, you're just bitter. You're just a loser. You just can't get a woman. Because these are common things we hear. I find many women actually respond to it and respect it more when a man refuses to back down on these things.
But also, don't let's forget, I was sitting the other night in the garden with 5 beautiful, strong, wonderful women on their own. Only one of them had children. The others are probably going not to have children. And they can't find a permanent relationship with men. Let's not forget that there's been a huge backlash on this latest generation of women, thanks to what has happened between men and women, thanks to this war. And it's a tragedy, as far as I can see. And it's one that these young women didn't bring upon themselves.
What do you mean?
In what way? What do I mean?
These women have brought a war. In what way has this war hurt these women? Gender war, I assume you mean.
It has meant that men, well, men, the organizations like men going their own way. Many men are turning their backs on permanent relationships with women. 70% of all young Japanese men have turned their backs, and they're not getting into relationships with their women. It is spreading. And these are the women who are facing the backlash. They want to be married, or they want to be in a permanent relationship, and they want children. But men are too afraid to commit, understandably. Tell me, Dean, would you advise a young man to get married these days?
I must be honest, as a married man, I would have a very hard time advising any young man to do that. And for all the reasons that we've mentioned of what can happen to you between losing your children, losing your income, possibly facing false allegations, possibly facing even prison time for something you didn't do, and for having it all blamed on you if it even happens.
Yeah.
No, I can't in good conscience advise it. But women need to hear that men are thinking this, because that's another key to getting women to understand, what have we done? What assumptions have we made? What assumptions have we accepted that have led to this dreadful state of affairs where I would love to be a mother and I can't, or if I want to be, I'm going to have to trap a man into it. That can't be making anybody happy. And the more savvy men get about it, the more women are going to have to respond to it, I think. Garnet, we seem to have lost Glen. We are running close to the 90-minute mark. I'm going to take a brief break and hope we can get Glen back. I have, as proof of the growing awareness on the Internet, there's a new YouTuber, goes by the name of Boigers, B-O-O-I-G-G-E-R-S, Boigers, who's done something called Men's Suicidal Life. And ladies, if any of you are listening, you should hear this. James, can we cue this up? It's just 2 minutes or so.
Married men commit suicide at a higher rate in our society.
A married man lives his life, supporting his wife and children.
When he faces an abuse, we, as a society, are indifferent to him.
He's lying. Men are stronger.
He must have abused her. He probably deserved it. It's a rare scenario.
A man is severely assaulted by his wife or girlfriend every 14.6 seconds.
When a man is battered by his spouse, there is no shelter which would take him.
The government, which should protect him, will imprison him, even if he's falsely accused by his wife.
He will lose his job and will be subjected to social shame. Family courts incentivizes his abuser by extorting money from him.
Divorce alienates him from his children, takes away his house and his money. A man who has lost his children, house, and social image receives new help from the same government, which he pays tax to.
All this helplessness leads to drug and alcohol abuse, which also makes him depressed and suicidal. This is a global phenomenon.
Lists of various suicide statistics per year of men, which far exceeds women's rates.
America.
India.
Australia.
Canada.
Lithuania.
Russia.
United Kingdom.
So many men kill themselves every year. What are we doing about it?
Men's rights. Human rights.
Brought to you by Cybersane.
Okay, now maybe that was a little hard to make out, because it seems to be a style that's getting very popular on YouTube, which is to use computer voices to do everything. But it's a powerful message, and we're hearing more and more of it. Men's rights are human rights, and look how bad this is. Do women have the compassion to really see that? Do you think, Erin?
I do. I'm lucky in that I live between London and LA, and I have open houses where I talk to young women, and they gather in groups. And the feeling I feel is those young women are quite bitter about what they see that the feminist movement did on their behalf, and feel now that they had no right to do it in their name. Of course, everybody, I include myself, I'm sure you do, equity feminism was a very healthy movement, but unfortunately it was undermined by radical feminists who had a completely different agenda. And this is the one that has won out and is now a billion-dollar industry, and it has no intention of ever giving up. But the time will come, exactly like we saw the wall came down in Germany, the Berlin Wall, we saw communist collapse overnight. It'll collapse.
There is a concept in group psychology, and we're getting ready to wrap up the show, but there's a concept in group psychology called preference falsification. And that is when a majority of people lie about or stay silent about how they really feel. And, of course, oppressive regimes will take advantage of this by bullying people into silence by various methods, sometimes literally in like communist or fascist regimes with gunpoint, but in others just by the weight of social pressure. But this is the way you can see revolutions, violent or peaceful, happen when all of a sudden the majority of people look at each other and say, you know, I've always thought this, you know, I've always thought this, and it just takes enough people to start speaking out, I believe, to make a big difference. We've lost Neil Lyndon. He did say he would probably have to leave.
No, I'm still here.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
I'd like to say something, please.
Sure, go ahead.
Which is that I don't accept the distinction that Erin draws between radical feminism and equity feminism. And I don't accept it in Christina Hoff Sommers or any other, or Warren, or any other of the authors who've tried to advance that distinction. In my book, the origins of feminism, the ideologies of feminism, going back to Engels and to Rousseau and to Mill, the idea that there was an opposition between men and women, and that women had to bond together, to band together in order to achieve change and equality. All of that is false. As far as I'm concerned, change for women has happened organically over the last 200 years, and with the consent, the active encouragement of men. And there was no need ever for women to represent their interests as being distinct from and opposed to men's. In my book, men's and women's interests have always been harmonious. They're nearly always identical. The only points on which they differ are actually childbirth itself and looking after children after birth. And even then, men are the best people to help women in those circumstances and have the same interest. And the entire proposition which we endorsed over the last 50 years, that women had to fight a war of liberation, whether it's, you know, for equality or a deeper concept, that entire proposition is false in my view.
Well, actually, Neil, can I just tell you, I'm 74, so I'm older than you are. But when I was a young girl, I had to get permission to get contraceptives. In other words, I had to prove.
You read my book? Have you actually read my book?
No.
Well, then I say goodbye.
Neil, you're a thoroughly unpleasant man and bitter with it.
Apparently so.
Get off my show.
Hello? Have we lost everybody?
No, you haven't lost me, but hopefully you've lost Neil.
I hope so.
He's an unpleasant man.
He turned unpleasant, that's for sure.
Oh, he does. Believe me.
All right, hang on. I'm going to have to call back into the show, I think. We've lost everybody.
Have you still got me?
Oh, yes, I do still have you. So,
we are still on the air.
Oh, we are still on the air. All right. Well, Neil, there was no call for that. Good gracious. All right, Neil. Well, we won't invite him back on the show again, but we did give him a chance to make some good points.
One moment, folks. Going to a music break.
the wildcat. Use a woman's touch. Must hold a promise. Would be worth a try. And we'd all be one. Or near enough. But that isn't what happened. And all I see is the hatred of women. For men like me. Men have no doubt. Just what they're for. We die at work. We die in war. Die at sea. As the lifeboats float ashore. Women and children. All aboard. We take the strain. We bear the load. Build the bridges. Sweep the roads. Build the houses that make the homes. Pay for but live alone. And the more that it happens, the more I see.
Third National Conference for Men and Boys taking place in Brighton in September. The idea is to get people together who are concerned about these issues that men and boys face and have different views. They think differently about those problems, but are prepared to spend time with other people seeking out what it is we agree on, not what we disagree on, and finding new ways forward to work together. And I think that's a lesson to take from today's conversation. We need to find out what it is we agree on and find ways of working together. And I'm really grateful for you guys for giving me the opportunity to spend some time finding out what it is that I agree with you on.
Thank you, Glenn. And this is good night from me, Dean. Good night from Dean. And good night, Glenn.
Good night, Erin.
You have been listening to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music is called Eternal Hope, and the closing piece is called Sunshine. Both pieces are by Kevin MacLeod and are used under the Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also wish to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and indeed all those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, in truth there is hope and healing, and we hope that you will be part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time in Revelations with Erin Pizzey.